What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Hope everyone's doing well. In this video, we're going to be building out a contacts application. Before we dive in, this video is taken directly from my full iOS interview mastery course, where I teach you the exact techniques that can land you six-figure jobs, and some even pay over $300,000 per year. I've personally passed interviews at this level at companies like Meta and Google, and I know exactly what it takes to succeed. This course gives you real-world challenges like the one we're going to dive into in a second, plus system design, data structures and algorithms, and other insider strategies to help you stand out. And you guys can view the full course curriculum on this info page, and once again, the link for that is in the description. You can get full access to this course as a one-time purchase, or access it through my monthly membership, which includes a ton of other premium content. The links for all these things is in the description, guys, so make sure you go ahead and check it out. Now let's jump back into this coding challenge. So here's an overview, guys, and then we're going to hop into a demo, and then we're going to hop into our problem statement. So this is something very similar to what you would see in a take-home or live interview scenario. So in the live setting, guys, you would probably get about 1 to 2 hours to try to build this out, and you would just be asked to get as far as you can. I've actually received this in an actual interview for a senior level position, and this was the exact structure. They said, hey, here's a prompt, just get as far as you can in the given time frame. I believe I had an hour or an hour and a half. And in a take-home interview scenario, you would be asked to complete all of these tasks. The code would be expected to be a little bit more polished, so on and so forth. So what is this going to test your knowledge of? Simple data modeling, navigation, app architecture, CRUD operations, that stands for create, update, and delete, and data persistence between views, and general Swift UI knowledge and functionality. Okay, guys, so let's go ahead and hop into a demo and see what we're going to be building here. So here is the completed application, guys. We see that we just have a very simple vertically scrollable list of contacts. Each contact displays the user's initials in this sort of circular initial view, their full name, and then their email in a vertical stack. And each one of these is navigatable to a detail screen. So if I click on, say, Michael Jordan, it will navigate over to an edit contact screen that populates all of their information here. And I'll have the ability to either edit or delete a contact here. So pay attention to a couple things. Pay attention to the presentation logic of the save button. It only becomes enabled if I actually change information on the contact. If it is the same as the original contact, it is not enabled and we could simply cancel. If I hit save, that will save my changes, as we can see here, back in the original contacts list. And to delete a contact, guys, we are going to present a confirmation alert. We can either cancel from there or simply delete the contact, and that will also update our list in real time. And we can also search for contacts here. So I could search for, say, Kobe, and that will filter down my list as I type. And if I exit out of the search component, it will just restore the list to its original state. And then last but not least, guys, we have the ability to obviously add a contact. So I could go back here and re-add Steph Curry. And we could say like steph@gmail.com and hit done. And that will immediately add him back to the list with his initials and all of that stuff. And as a bonus feature, we're also going to be implementing a swipe to delete feature here. So we can simply delete a contact by swiping directly on our list. So that's the completed version of our application, guys. Now let's check out our problem statement to get the full details on what exactly it is we're going to be required to build here. So here is a formalized list of our requirements, guys. We have, first off, our data model requirements. So this is what every contact is going to be required to have: a first name, a last name, and an email, as we see in our list here. Here's our viewing contacts requirements. We need to display a scrollable list, display the contact initials, and next to that, display first name, last name, and email, as we can see here in the UI. We're going to have to be able to add a contact, as we saw with our functionality here. Edit a contact, as we saw with our functionality on this edit screen. So enable save button only if changes have been made. If changes have been made and a user tries to exit, show an alert confirmation. So this is another cool feature. If I try to change my contact again and try to cancel, we're going to get this alert confirmation that says, hey, are you sure you want to discard your changes? So that's another one. And I've marked those with bonus features, guys. That is sort of how that's structured in a live interview setting. They say, hey, like, come back to these if you have time. And that's sort of how we'll structure this. Then we have our searchability. So this point is important. We should be able to search on a user's name or email. So for example, with Alan Iverson, if I start typing out answer, he shows up. Also, if I type out Alan, he is the only one that shows up in the list. So we need to search on both the user's name and their email. Here are our requirements for deleting a contact. We need to add a deletion button on the details screen, as we see here. Add confirmation alert to delete, as we see here. And then swipe to delete, which is another bonus feature that we saw back there. And here's our navigation logic, guys. So adding a contact should be a modal sheet, as we see like this. And edit contact should be a navigation push to a contact details screen, as we see here. So some important points about persistence. The list should persist for the session, meaning that we don't need long-term storage like core data. So if I delete, like let's say Alan Iverson, kill my app and come back, we'll notice that we don't need to have data persistence there, but that will be part of our follow-up questions is how we could potentially implement that. And guys, here's some follow-up questions, like I said just now, and we'll come back to these at the end of the problem. So now that we've gone through our problem statement, a full demo, and the overview, let's go ahead and now jump into actually getting started with the code, guys. But before we actually write our first line of code, guys, there's something extremely important I want to talk about and stress the importance of. In live interview examples, it is very important that you communicate your thought processes as you go through your building the application line by line. It's very important to communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it in live interviews. So as I talk through this example and as I code, I want you to make sure that you are looking at this through that lens of me actually communicating this information to a live interviewer, because you're going to be expected to do the same. Interviewers want to gain insights into your thought processes. They want to understand why you're doing what you're doing, and they want to see how you think. And they also want to see how good your communication skills are. Ultimately, you're going to be potentially working together with these people, and it's important that you have good communication skills and that you can collaborate and work together on things. So keep that in mind as we go through, and make sure you're practicing that as well. I don't care if you got to talk out loud to yourself as you're writing code. It's an extremely important skill to develop. It's something that I've obviously gotten extremely good at because of doing these instructionals. And it's something that you guys are going to need to get good at as well if you are ever going to do a live coding interview. So we're going to start this off by acting like we're talking to an interviewer, okay? So I would say to the interviewer that the first thing I'm going to get started with is our data modeling, right? I think that provides a good infrastructure for how the rest of the project is going to be built. And it's an easy thing for us to knock out. So I'm going to go up to the contacts app folder, and we're going to create a new model folder, and I'm going to create my data model. And this is going to be called a contact. So if we look back at the prompt really quickly, guys, we need a first name, a last name, and an email. So I'm going to create a struct here, and I'm going to call it a contact. And I'm going to make this conform to the identifiable protocol. And that's because we need to display these things in a scrollable list, and anything that you display in a list in SwiftUI should conform to the identifiable protocol. So we're going to start this out by giving it an ID. And then we're going to have a first name and a last name. And let me actually capitalize that N there. And then we are also going to have an email, right? So because our contact is ultimately going to be editable, I want to make certain properties variables here so that I can mutate them. We're going to leave the ID as a constant because our contact ID should never change. And that is going to be how we uniquely identify each contact. And the first name, however, can definitely change. Last name can change, and email can change. So it's important to make those things variables because later on, we're going to need to be able to edit contacts and ultimately potentially mutate those properties. So next up, I am probably also going to want to conform to the hashable protocol here. I know that these things need to end up being navigation links, and the hashable protocol conformance is required for that as well. And with other pieces of functionality in the app, like checking to see if a contact has been changed and stuff in the editing screen, we're going to want to make sure that we have hashable and identifiable conformance. And I believe that will automatically give us like equatable conformance as well. So we can check to see if two contacts are equal to each other. If not, we can always come back and add that later. And I want to take a quick pause here, guys, and go over some notes about some of the things we did when defining that contact object that display a high-level understanding of data modeling. So first off, we added properties that weren't listed in the prompt to our contact object, but they are necessary for this application. So that's the ID property that we see here. So each contact should be uniquely identifiable for multiple reasons. One, we need that to display them in a list. And we are also going to need that later on to check to make sure one contact is equal to the other or not. And that's going to help us out with this editing functionality. So that's point number one, right? That wasn't communicated in the prompt, but we knew to do it anyway because of some of the functionality that's required in this application. That displays a high-level understanding of just how to model data. Next, we added the correct protocol conformances. So we added these conformances to identifiable and hashable, once again, to make sure that everything works smoothly from within a Swift UI context or perspective, to display our data, to make sure we can use navigation links correctly, so on and so forth. And that also relates to our CRUD operations with the create, update, and delete stuff, which is going to come into play when we want to implement those pieces of functionality, guys. Those protocol conformances are going to help us do that. And then lastly, we displayed knowledge of constants versus variables. So we made these three properties variables because ultimately we're going to have to be able to mutate them. That by no means was communicated in the prompt and would be something that you're expected to know. Maybe not right off the bat, but when we did get to the editing part of the application, you would need to know to make these variables. But the fact that we did this right away displays a lot of strength and understanding in that we're setting our project up the right way from the beginning. So it lets the interviewer know that, hey, we're already thinking about these things from the get-go. And that just displays a lot of high-level understanding when it comes to your data modeling and overall Swift UI knowledge and iOS knowledge as well. And these are the kinds of things that you're going to be expected to know and implement as a senior iOS dev in these sort of live interview settings, guys. So now that we've gone through that and sort of what the expectation is there and how to meet it, let's go ahead and continue with our app development. So I'm going to sort of switch back to interview mode here and say, okay, now that we've set up our data model, we can hop into the next point and start working on our UI. So I'm going to create another folder here. And really quickly, guys, this communicates like strong file organization. This is why I'm so like sort of anal about this. Like in the professional world, files are very, very like neatly structured and ordered. And it's important to do that in an interview as well. You don't want to write messy code. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and create a contacts view here. All right, guys, so we have our contacts view here, and you guys might be seeing some files and stuff in here that you don't recognize. And that's because I had to come back and refilm a small portion of this video. Part of the file got corrupted. So if you guys see anything that you don't recognize, that's why. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our UI here. So the first thing I'm going to start with, guys, is creating some mock data. So I'm just going to paste that in there. And you guys can pause the video and type this out. Just create some mock contacts here. So it's just an array of contacts, and then we're going to create a list and display some information about these contacts. So I'm going to say list for each contact, contacts, contact in, and then let's maybe just say text like contact.email. And we should get that displaying there. So that looks pretty good. We obviously need to build out this full sort of contact cell or contact row view. So that is where this video is going to sort of pick up at, guys. That's where the file corruption stopped. So what I want you to do right now is create a new file for the contacts row view. We have it right here, and the video is going to pick back up right at this point where we start creating this contacts row view, inject a contact, and gets this UI built out and some preview information built out as well. So sorry for the confusion or the mix up there, guys. Everything should go smoothly from here. So this is going to pick back up with the contacts row view, and basically back inside of the contacts view, we're going to say something like contact row view and pass in the contact. All right, so see you guys in the rest of the video. So the first thing I notice is that we're going to need to create some sort of computed property to get the user's initials or the contact's initials. That's something we can come back to. I just want to get the UI built out for each one of these cells first, since we're already here. So I know that this is going to be an H stack. And then next to that H stack is, so we're going to have like our circle here, and then we'll have our user info here. And this is going to be a V stack. So we know that this is going to be text, and it's going to be the, we need to do some string interpolation here. We're going to say contact.firstname plus, and then we have a space, and then another string interpolation of contact.lastname. Yeah, so that's our full name right there. And then below that, we're going to want our text for the contact email. And it looks like we're going to want to make this a foreground style of gray. And we want to make this V stack have an alignment of .leading. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. Next up for this circle, like I said, we'll come back and bring this sort of initials guy back in later. But I think we could just add a placeholder for now. We could say like MJ. And then we are going to give this a foreground style of white, it looks like. And then we're going to give it a frame. Width and height, it looks like it's about 48 by 48. A background of some type of color that's like system gray 4 or 5. And a clip shape of dot circle. All right, so yeah, that looks pretty awesome right there. So that's pretty good for our UI so far. Next up, I can add a spacer at the end of all this to sort of push that all the way to the left. And if I want, I could also add some horizontal padding to that. So now that we have our row view built out, let's go ahead and go back to our contacts view and replace this with our contact row view. And just pass our contact along. Yeah, so that looks good. And actually, because this is already in a list, I don't think we need to add that padding. I think by default, the list already adds padding, so we can go back here and probably delete that and go back to our contacts view and see how this looks. Okay, that looks really good. Next up, while we're here, I know that we ultimately want this to be searchable, and we want to be able to navigate from each one of these items to a new screen. So we could go ahead and just embed this guy in a navigation stack. And then we could also make this searchable. And we're going to need text and prompt, it looks like. So we're going to need to create a state property for our search text. So I could do that here. State private var search text. And just make that a blank string. Pass that along here. My prompt can just be search. And this looks pretty good. And then it looks like our navigation title is contact. So let me do that as well. All right, so this has already started to come together pretty nicely, guys. So right there, that just really communicates to an interviewer that you are very fluid with Swift UI. And that is sort of what the expectation would be for me with the senior engineer. If we were choosing to do a Swift UI interview. Obviously, not every iOS engineer is fluent in Swift UI. But if I worked at a company where all we were using was Swift UI, or we're trying to transition into Swift UI, this would be very important. And this is the type of interview I would be giving. And like I said, this is an exact interview that I've actually received. So to continue, I just want to compare what we currently have to the completed application. We have our search bar. We have our cells, but we notice that we have this toolbar button up at the top. So I think that's what we're going to work on creating next. The ability to click this button and have it modally present a sheet that will allow us to add a new contact. So first thing I'm going to do is add that toolbar button. So I'm going to use the toolbar modifier to do that. And we're going to have a toolbar item with placement and content. And it's going to be in the trailing spot. And the content is just going to be a button. And that is going to have an action and a label. And the label is going to be image system name with plus, right? Pretty straightforward. And here, ultimately, we're going to just toggle some property to handle the presentation of our sheet. So we could add that now as well. I could say at state private var show add contact view, and check that out. Our autocomplete or our predictive code model already handles that for us. I don't really think we need to cast the data as a Boolean. I think we could just set it equal to false and let Swift's type inference handle the rest. So next up, we're going to then say show add contacts view dot toggle here. And then we need to add a sheet modifier to this. And if we remember from the prompt, guys, let's go back here. Our navigation logic, add contact should be a modal sheet as we see here, and edit contact should be a navigation push. So we're going to do this first, and then we're going to do the edit contact screen next. So really quickly, let's go ahead and create that add contacts view. So I'm going to create a new Swift UI view called add contact view. And for now, let's just say text add contact. And let's go back to our contacts view and add a sheet to our list. We'll use the is presented option, and we'll say show add contact view. And our content is going to be our add contact view. And I always like to remove that content word and just clean the code up a little bit like so. All right, so now we could test this out. Okay, so we're modally presenting a sheet. We do notice that this sheet does not come all the way up. This is like a sheet with a certain sort of presentation detent. So we can go ahead and add that capability now here as well. So I can say add contact view dot presentation detents, and I could go here and say dot medium. That's one of the preset options that I like to use, and that should be totally fine. If we need to get it to a custom height later on, we can come back to that. Okay, so while we're still on this screen here, we have our modal presentation sort of knocked out. Next up, I think we could get into making these items tappable and ultimately have them navigate to an edit contact view. So what I would do to accomplish that is make this contacts row view a navigation link. So I would just cut this and say each one of these is going to be a navigation link, and we're going to use the value and label option. The value is going to be our contact. The label is just going to be our contact row view. And then we're going to add the navigation destination modifier to get us over to the edit contact screen. So we are going to make this for a contact.self. The destination is going to pass a contact in there. We could just go here and say, for now, it's going to be text context or contact.firstname. Cool. So now we notice that each one of these has the disclosure indicator, and if I tap on it, it takes me over to a detail view with information about the contact. So this is awesome so far, and it's really coming together really quickly. And we're only like 20 minutes into this video, and that has included me breaking things down and adding notes and going over the prompt and all that stuff. So that gives you guys an idea of how fast you can put this stuff together as a high-level engineer. But anyway, let's keep going. We are going to build out the UI for the add contact view. And after that, we're going to go into the edit contact view. And that's really going to wrap most of our UI work up. And then we can come back to adding functionality to those screens. So let's keep this up and let's hop back into the add contact view and get started. So as I would talk through this, guys, I would just sort of talk through what I see in the UI. So I would mention that this looks like we could leverage the use of a navigation toolbar so that we don't have to create sort of a custom view. So I'm going to wrap this up in a navigation stack to start things off. It looks like this is contained within like a form. So we could use a form there. We could also use a list. I don't think it really matters. And then we're going to give this a toolbar, and we're going to create our toolbar items. So we're going to have a toolbar item with placement and content. First one is leading. Content is going to be a cancel button. So it should just be button, cancel. And I believe we're just going to want this to dismiss the screen, right? So let's see. We hit cancel, and it doesn't look like there's any other functionality associated with that. I would clarify that with the interviewer. And if there's not, we can just implement a dismissal function, and we can use that with the environment dismissal property. So we can say dismiss, var dismiss, and we could go here and just call the dismiss action. Okay. Next up, it looks like we are going to want a done button. So guys, let's go ahead and grab this, paste it, top bar trailing, button is going to be done. And this is going to be, it looks like a headline button. Yep, it's bolded. And we are going to probably want this to dismiss as well, but we're also going to want to add a contact. So this is something that we're going to come back to when we get into adding our functionality to this screen. Let's just go ahead and finish up by adding our text fields here. So it looks like I'm going to want 3 state properties, one for my first name, and I could just copy and paste this a couple times, last name, and email. And now I'm going to build out these text fields. So this should be pretty straightforward. So I'm going to say I want a text field here with a title, key, and text. And this one is going to be first name. And bind that to the first name property. And we're going to do the same thing for last name. So we'll go here and bind that to the last name state property. And then we want the same thing for our email. And bind that to the email property. And I would actually add a couple modifiers to this email text field. We could say things like keyboard type is .email address, just so that when the user is using this in an actual application and the keyboard pops up, it has all of the necessary sort of keyboard or email components. And we could also say .text content type is .email address. And this will give built-in system functionality for pre-populating the user's email and stuff like that. So these are 2 like really nice to haves that really sort of flex your Swift UI knowledge, guys, and overall iOS knowledge of how the system works with filling out a form. So those are 2 big nice to haves there. You could also add things like .text input auto capitalization is like never, because emails are typically never capitalized and they're all lowercase. So that looks really good there. And that's for now going to wrap it up for our add contact view. Let's go back to our contacts view and see what this looks like with our presentation detents. So we go here. And we need a navigation title as well. And we don't need this to be of medium height. We could probably shorten it a little bit with a custom height. So back in our add contact view, we're going to say .navigation title, add contact. And we definitely don't want that to be the large title display mode. It's not doing that in the completed app. So let's make .navigation bar title display mode .inline. So this looks great. And back here, we could replace the medium with .height, I believe, and let's try like 300 pixels. And that looks really good. And I would make a quick comment, guys, that says it's typically not great to use hard-coded values with this. So you could perform some sort of calculation based on like the number of fields you have or something like that, so that the presentation detents would automatically adjust. So I would just make a quick note of that. That's definitely not something I would bother with implementing in a live interview. Also really quickly, let me just clean this up. Perfect. So this is looking really good. Next up, let's go ahead and build out the edit contact screen. So I'm going to create a new view for that, and it's going to be called edit contacts view, or edit contact view rather. And we need to pass in a contact here. So we're going to say let contacts be a contact. And we also need to sort of recreate this form that we have from our add contact view. And we just need to pre-populate that with the contact data. So we need our preview here. We can definitely just grab that from our contact row view. So we can grab this and paste it in there like so. So now our preview will build. And next up, we need to create this form and this delete contact button at the bottom. So to me, that indicates that we want to be inside of a VStack here. We want to have some sort of form. And then we want to have this delete button down at the bottom. So I can say button delete, and we could just say delete contact here. And we could style that later on. And for the form, we have this pretty much exactly inside of the add contact view. So we could just go ahead and grab all of this stuff from inside the form. And ideally, we would want to maybe create like a reusable form to reuse between both of these views instead of copy and pasting code. But for the interest of saving time here, I'm just going to copy and paste this stuff. So it looks like we need properties bound to these text fields. So we have a couple options of how we could accomplish this. We could make like state properties for each one. Var first name equals this and that and that. Or we could actually make this contact property a state property and bind them through use of the contact object. And I actually like that approach better because this way we won't have to like recreate our contact object using these properties. We can just make this a state property like so, and write an initializer here and initialize that with the contact that gets passed in like so. And this will allow us to then bind through the contact. And anytime these properties get changed, it will automatically propagate those changes on this contact object. And we can then, perform the necessary operations from there. Whereas before we would, instead of having all those individual properties, that's a little bit more messy to me. So I like this approach better, but either way works fine. This is just my preference. So this looks pretty good. Next up, what do we want to do? We need to make sure that we build out our toolbar as well. So we don't want to wrap this inside of a navigation stack because this is a detail view and the contacts view is the parent. So we can just go ahead and create a toolbar here. And I can reuse the code for my add contact view because we have cancel and save. And we're also going to need our dismissal guy. So I could go here and say environment /dismiss var dismiss. And that error should then go away. And this is going to be save instead. And then our navigation title is going to be edit contacts, and navigation bar title display mode is .inline. Okay, so let's go back to our contacts view and then make sure that we are going to our edit contact view from here and pass along our contact that we get from our navigation destination closure. So we go here and there's our edit contact view. That looks really, really good. Awesome. Okay, it looks like we want to hide the back button too. We definitely don't want a back and a cancel. So let's go ahead and go back to edit contact view and say dot navigation bar back button hidden. Take a look at how that looks. Go here and that looks great. So this will dismiss, this will save and dismiss. So this is looking really, really good. So that just about wraps it up for our user interface, guys. Next up, once again, just want to take a quick pause here to sort of go over everything we just did and how we explained it. So I'm going to hop back into the edit contact view. And the first thing I want to mention is how we talked about that copy and pasting code here isn't ideal. And that ideally we would want to, in a perfect world, create maybe some sort of reusable form to use across both the add contact and edit contact view. But for the interest of time, we went ahead and said, hey, let's just copy and paste this. So that communicates a couple things to an interviewer. It lets them know that you have the right priorities in mind, like getting as far as possible with a balance of like good code is the goal of this interview here. It's not to write the most perfect code and make everything like pixel perfect, essentially. It's to communicate to them that, hey, maybe this could be done better here, but I want to get as far as I can here. That's the priority. That's the main goal. That's what dictates success in this scenario. So I'm going to stick to that. And that translates, or that concept translates into the professional environment as well. There's a lot of times where you might not be able to implement the most perfect solution for something, and you might have to prioritize a deadline, right? So communicating that understanding to an interviewer is very, very important, and it's something that will give you a lot of brownie points there. So that's thing number one. Thing number two was how we talked about different approaches of accomplishing the same thing. And that was related to how we passed along these binding string properties to each one of our text fields here. So the other approach would have been to create 3 separate state properties and pass those along as we did in the add contact view. And we can leave this up here for now. And when we come back to the functionality of actually editing this screen, we'll see how both approaches can be used. The main point I want to make here is that we talked about different ways of doing things and then made a decision and justified our decision. That's another really important point to make in this scenario, where interviewers will want to see you think through different scenarios, identify the pros and cons of both, and justify why you pick one approach, right? That indicates to them that not only do you have widespread knowledge and understanding of how to accomplish things in multiple ways, but you are a good decision maker as well and can defend your decisions, right? A lot of discussions in programming come about when you work with multiple engineers in a professional environment, or if you're building an app and just working with other people, of the best way of doing something. You guys have conversations about it, and then ultimately you pick one, and you have to be able to defend your decisions. And that's something we did here as well. So there's a lot of little things happening here as I go through this that you guys should pay attention to. And like I'm doing here, I'll always take a pause, say, hey guys, we're going to pause here and talk about what I just did there. And these will give you brownie points in interviews and make you a more favorable candidate when it comes to ultimately selecting a future employee. And it's just a good way to code too, right? And this should be what your thought process is like as you build things anyway. It's just the hallmarks of a good engineer. But anyway, let's go ahead and now hop back into interview mode and get started with some more functionality. We're going to jump into actually implementing these initial views here and then creating a view model and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and continue on, guys. Hop back into the prompt and just get an idea of where we are. So it looks like we got our contacts data guide done. I'm just going to add check marks here, guys. Viewing contacts. Let's see. We have a vertically scrollable list. We need to do this next. We have this as well. We are displaying the, what's it called? The first name, last name, and email. We have the screen here, but not the functionality. So we'll leave that. We have the screen, but not the functionality. No functionality, no functionality. But our navigation logic is good as well. So this is looking not too bad, right? So that's checked off. And okay. So guys, let's go ahead and jump into the first piece of functionality I want to implement with displaying our contact initials. So the first question we have is, where do we put this? Like, this has to be some sort of computed property or method to get these initials. Where do we want to put that code? I think it's best to put it on the contact object itself. That way we can access the initials from anywhere we have a contact object. Another option would be to put it on something like a view model or directly on the view, but I think putting it as a computed property on the model is the best thing to do. So let's go ahead and make a variable for initials here, and it's going to be an optional string. And here's how we're going to do this, guys. We're going to take the first name and the last name, and we're just going to grab the first letter from both things. So we are going to say that we want let first equal first name dot prefix 1, let last equal last name dot prefix 1, and that just gets us the first letter for each thing. And then we're just going to return a string with first plus last. And I'm not even sure if we need to make this optional, because we should be guaranteed to have a first name and last name every time. Yeah, so we're good to go there. And let's go back to our contact row view and see if we can implement that. So here we just had a hard-coded text of MJ. Now, guys, we'll be able to just say contact.initials, right? So let's delete these comments as well. So that's one reason I liked having it on the contact object itself, because now we can access those initials anywhere we need to that we have a contact object. If we put it on something like a view model, then we would need to make sure that we have access to that view model in whatever view we are, currently operating within. If we put it only on this view, it would be encapsulated to or unique to this view only. And I don't like that. So like if we ever wanted to put it somewhere here, like in a header view or, anywhere else in the app, we have access to it through the contact object. And I like that. Okay, so that's great. Let's go ahead and check that off of our prompt as well. So let's grab our checkmark guy. Oops. Check that out, or check that off, and check this off too. So we're looking good here. All right, guys, now let's go over how we could potentially add a contact. So if we go back to our contacts view, right now we have this state var for our contacts. And the reason we made it a state property is so that we could potentially mutate it. So we have an interesting problem that we need to solve here, right? The screen for adding a contact is a completely separate component that exists outside of the contacts view. So we don't have access to this contacts data source, right? So we could do a couple different things. We could pass this along as a binding to our add contact view. That way, when we fill out this form and create a contact, we could append it to this array and it would propagate that change back to the contacts view via that binding and state relationship, and it would update our list. So that's one option. Another option would be to create a view model or data store that houses our contacts, and we could then inject that view model into the environment of the view or as an environment object and manage all sort of CRUD operations through the view model. So I think that's a much better approach. I think it follows the solid architecture principles much more closely with a separation of concerns and creates a more modular code base. So that's the approach that I want to take here. So we can go and create another folder here for our view model. I'm going to create a Swift file, and it's going to be contacts view model. And I am going to import observation and use the new observable macro here for my contacts view model class. I'm going to have an array of contacts, and it's going to equal this contact array. And then I'm going to have like some sort of function here that mimics like fetching our contacts. So, this mimics what you would see in like a real world application. So that's why I'm implementing this functionality this way. We might have to fetch these contacts from like a remote database or a local database, something like that. So that's what I'm going to do here. So we can go back to our contacts view and just grab these contacts and go here and say contacts equals this contact array, and just go like this. I think that'll work. So we've essentially just extracted the responsibility of populating our contacts array to a view model. And with the use of the observable macro, we can now observe changes on this contacts object. And this will follow into all of our CRUD operations. So we can house all of those CRUD operations for adding contacts and deleting contacts in our view model. And once again, that creates a much better separation of concerns and a much more modular code base. This is also going to set us up to do things like add unit tests and stuff if we were to want to do that. So let's go back to our contacts view, and we're going to make a state property, private var view model for our contacts view model. And now we're going to have to loop through our view model.contacts. Okay, so let's see if our functionality it remains the same. Okay, yeah, we actually need to call that function. So back in the contacts view model on init, we could just say fetch contacts. If we wanted to use async await, we could use like a task modifier and stuff, but we don't need to do that in the current context. So back here, now our list should populate. Yes, we're good to go there. And everything still looks good. Okay, so how does this help us solve this problem of adding a contact here? So now what I want to do is, as I mentioned before, inject this view model as an environment property on the add contact view. So I'm going to go here and say .environment view model, and now I'll be able to go to the add contact view and add another environment property here, which is my contacts view model .self var view model. And now I'll be able to, through means or via the view model, add my contact from here. And need to go here and also set that up on the preview so we don't have a crash. So that's going to be our contacts view model. So ultimately here, I need to like create a contact from using these values, and then through use of the view model, append that contact to my data source. And let's make sure our preview is good to go. Yes, so we're good to go. So I typically like to create a private extension on my views to house the functions. So I could say func add contact. And then we could simply go here and say add contact. And we pretty much just need to construct a contact through the properties that we have. So we're going to say let contact equal contact. ID can just be some, uuid.uuid string, first name, last name, and email. And we could go here and we could either just say directly like viewModel.contacts.append contact, or we could have some sort of method on the view model itself. And I feel like that second option is the way to go. And the reason for that is because I want to house or encapsulate all of our CRUD operations in one place, and I don't want to have them scattered across multiple components. So back in our view model, we can make a couple functions. Let's just go ahead and create one to add a contact. And we could simply say contacts.append contact here. And while we're at it, we could make a function to delete a contact, which is a contact, and update a contact. And we could fill out the implementation for these functions a little later. But once again, now all of our CRUD operations are encapsulated within this view model instead of being scattered across components. Like we don't want the update function to exist, or the logic for that to exist within the edit screen, and the add function to exist within the add contact screen. They're all in one place and they all modify this data source here. So I think the logic for that is better. So back in our add contact view, we would then simply just go here and call viewModel.addContact, which is our contact. And ideally, if we have time, we could come back and implement some form validation here just to make sure that the form meets the requirements for, maybe having a valid email, a valid name, so on and so forth. But for now, we'll just assume valid inputs. So this looks pretty good. Add contact and dismiss. Let's go ahead and see if we can test this out. That should be good enough for our preview to actually add a contact. So here, let's do Scotty Pippin, Scotty@gmail.com, hit done, and that adds our contact there beautifully. So our add contact functionality is working. Let's go ahead and head back to our prompt and check that off our list. So we go here and we can now add a contact. Next up, I think what we can do is get started with our edit contact functionality. So let's see, guys, we're going to need to allow users to edit an existing contact's details, add some presentation logic for the save button, and if changes have been made, try to add an alert confirmation. But these two guys are bonus features, so we're going to focus on just the main functionality of this first and then come back to these later if we have time. That's what I would say to the interviewer there, obviously. So let's go and start implementing our edit contact functionality. And before we get started with that, guys, really quickly, wanted to just go back to the add contact view and discuss what happened when we got to line 60 here with the adding contact. We had the option to simply just add the logic for adding a contact to our view model's data source directly from the view. But we chose to put that in the view model and explained that we want to encapsulate all of the CRUD functionality, or all of the code that is involved with manipulating and updating this data source inside of this view model component. So this allows for better encapsulation, and explaining that to the interviewer is very important so that they can see how you structure your code and how you think sort of logically through these problems. And that's my approach of doing this. You guys could absolutely use other approaches. Just make sure that you explain to the interviewer why you are choosing to do it that way and why you think it's the best way of accomplishing it. So guys, let's go to our edit contact view now. Let's actually see where we're at with clicking on this guy. So this looks really good, right? So now we just need to be able to actually edit that contact and save it. So guys, inside of our edit contact view, I believe we're going to need to add our view model to that as well. So we're going to want to place our, what's it called? View model as an environment object or on the environment of our edit contact view. And we're going to want to get this line of code here as well, where we, access the view model through the environment property wrapper there. So edit contact view here, and we're good to go. Okay, so ultimately, guys, when we delete a contact, let's just go ahead and start filling out our implementation for these functions. We're going to say view model.delete contact, which would be that contact that we pass in here. And also, we would go here and say we want to add our contact. So let's actually make a private extension, or sorry, update our contact. Edit contact view, func update contact, which is our, actually we don't need an input parameter there. And here we could just call update contact. And this would just be view model.update contact with that contact, right? And to ensure that our preview still works, let's just go ahead and add our view model as an environment here, contacts view model. Cool. And we can also make a function here to delete our contact, guys, that just calls the delete contact method, viewModel.delete contact, which is our contact. And let's just go ahead and make sure we call this in the right place. Boom. Once again, that isn't completely necessary. I just like having all of my functionality like encapsulated in some sort of extension on the view so that it's not hard for me to find it when I'm digging through the code. So I know that this is my delete contact function. I don't have to go here and find it inside of my view body. And if this function gets more complex, I don't want to clog up my view with a bunch of code that involved in deleting a contact, right? I just want to call a simple function here, which is why I like doing this. So let's go ahead and see if we can resume our preview and see if this works. And guys, that should be all we need to do. So let's go ahead and see if that works. Actually, we need to call dismiss here as well. And we can just call dismiss here as well. And let's go ahead and test this out, man. It should be as easy as that. Or actually, nope. We have to implement the functionality inside of our view model. So let's go ahead and jump into our view model and actually add the implementations for these functions now. Okay, guys, so this is going to test your ability to actually manipulate a data source. Can you find this contact in that array of contacts and delete it? I want you guys to pause the video and see if you can accomplish that yourself. The same thing with updating the contact. And once you do try that out, come back to the video and see if our solutions match. Okay, so guys, in order to delete this particular contact, we need to search through our array here, find it, and then remove it at that particular index. So ultimately, what we want to call is contacts.remove at index, right? So we need to find the index of this contact. So I'm going to say guard let index equal contacts dot first index where 0.id equals our contact.id. Else return. And then I'm going to remove my contact at that index. So this is where having that unique identifier really comes in handy. It helps us find a contact in that array very easily with the use of this line of code here. So because we know that each contact will have a unique identifier, we can absolutely check the equatability of contacts using the ID property. So that's super nice to have. And updating our contact is going to be very, very similar. Instead of removing the contact at that index, we are simply going to replace the contact at that index. So we're going to need this guy here again. And then we're just going to say contacts index equals that updated contact. So that's it for the implementation of our functions there, guys. Now, if we go back to our contacts view, we should be able to test this out to see if it's working. So I'm going to go and say, I want to change jumpman23@gmail.com to gmail.co, save, and check that out, guys. it updates and it propagates that change back to our data source. So that looks absolutely incredible. And let's go ahead and see if we can delete a contact as well. Same thing, we're good to go there. So let's head back to our prompts and check that item off of our list. So we can delete a contact and we can edit a contact. And like I said, we'll come back to our bonus features later. Next up, we need to implement searchability. So let's go ahead and see if we can do that. Back to our contacts view and check out what we got going on with our searching. So we have search text here and we have this searchable modifier somewhere right here. So we just need to make sure that we filter through the contacts based on certain criteria. So we're going to want to make sure that we check the user's full name and also their email and return the filtered results. So how are we going to do that? I think the best place to put that is on the view model. So what we can do is make another function here, guys, for like filtered contacts, or we could call it search results. And we are going to say, check that out, man. I really love the code prediction with the new Xcode 16. It's awesome. So this is going to return an array of contacts. So we just need to pass along this query, right? And guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to say guard that the query is empty. And I'm going to just hit tab there. So if the query isn't empty, then we're just going to, or sorry, is empty, then we're going to return the contacts. Pretty simple, right? Next up, if it's not empty, we're going to say return view, contacts dot filter, and we're going to say $0 dot first name dot localized case insensitive contains our query, or we can just copy and paste this and do the same thing on last name, or email, and remove those or statements there. And that's it for our search results. So basically, we make sure the query isn't empty. And if it is, we return our contacts, right? So it would just return this. And if it's not empty, then we filter based on this query and we check the first name and we use this localized case insensitive contains. So this will make sure that everything is basically localized and lowercased when it's checked against the query. And same thing for last name, same thing for email. So that's all we should have to do for our searching, guys. Next up, we can go into our contacts view and I could make a computed property here called search results, which is an array of contacts. And I could say return viewModel.search results for that search text. And instead of looping through viewModel.contacts, we're just going to loop through our viewModel.search results, or these search results here. So now let's test this out. If I say Jumpman, check that out, dude. Working beautifully. Kobe. And if I click on him, it goes to Kobe Bryant's contact. If I edit him and save it, it updates that there. It updates that when I cancel. And that is looking absolutely beautiful, guys. So that wraps it up for our search functionality. So let's go back to our prompt and check that off our list as well. Boom, boom, and that wraps up the whole thing. And before we hop into implementing our bonus features with our edit contact and contact deletion, guys, once again, I'm going to take a quick pause here and talk about what we just did with that searchable functionality. So back in our contacts view, we implemented this search results computed property that calls on this viewModel.search results function. So the big takeaway here is, why did we put the logic for filtering our results on the view model instead of putting it on the view? Oftentimes when you see examples like this for how to implement the searchable functionality in a SwiftUI list, you'll see the logic inside of the view. I think it's better to put in the view model for multiple reasons. One is testability. So if we want to test our search functionality, now this functionality exists on the view model and we could write tests to make sure that it works as expected. Whereas if we put that on the view, it would be harder to test that functionality, or we would have to write UI tests, whereas here we can write unit tests for this functionality. So another thing, guys, is overall code encapsulation and modularization, and really like creating a separation of concerns here. Everything involved with updating or manipulating our data source, all of that functionality exists within our view model. We don't have certain functionality or pieces of like stuff that is responsible for doing that on the view model, and other pieces scattered across our app in different views that's kind of random, and it doesn't really adhere to the solid architecture principles, where we don't want to mix responsibilities. We want each thing to have its own responsibility, and this view model is responsible for just that, supplying our view with data and updating that data whenever under whatever circumstances, whether it's our CRUD operations or our filter operations, right? All of that stuff exists on the view model, and that is much better in terms of code modularization and separation of concerns. So that's why I chose to put this here. And explaining that stuff in an interview is very important, guys. It communicates to the interviewer that really you just know what you're talking about, right? And your code is very well structured, and you keep clean architecture and solid architecture in mind as you're building a project. So now that we've talked about that and sort of gone over our reasoning as to why we did that, let's hop back into our prompt and see what we're going to do next. So I want to implement these two features next with editing our contact. So we want to enable the save button only if changes have been made to the contact. So that's going to be an interesting challenge. And if changes have been made and the user tries to exit, we're going to show an alert. So let's hop into our edit contact view and get started with that. So ultimately, to solve this problem, we're going to need to check to see if this contact has changed. So basically what we can do, guys, is add another state property here called contact did change. And we're going to set that equal to false, right? Obviously, when this screen initializes, we haven't changed anything. So what I'm going to do to detect changes on this contact is say .onChange of our contact, old value, new value. And inside of this block, we could simply say contact did change is true. Now, this doesn't completely solve the problem yet, but it does get us started in the right direction. So basically, guys, this doesn't handle a situation if like I change the contact here and then I change it back to what the original state was, right? So if I change it to like gmail.net, but then I say, hey, I want to change it back to gmail.com, you notice the save button becomes disabled again because all of these things are equal to what the original contact was. So I need some means of detecting if this contact that we are modifying here is equal to the original contact that I passed in. So what I'm going to do is create a property called original contact. And it's going to be a contact. And I'm going to say self.originalContact is equal to that contact. So this is basically going to be our reference to check to see if this contact that gets modified as the user makes changes in these fields is we're going to check this guy against this guy. And this will always just be equal to the original contact that was passed in. It's never going to change. That's why we're making it a let constant and we're not making it a state property. Because we never want to be able to mutate this. This will serve as our sort of original like source of truth. So now down in my onChange modifier, I'm going to say contact did change is equal to new value is not equal to our original contact. So everything should build there accordingly. And guys, this comes back to the original point of why we implemented hashable conformance along with the identifiable protocol. I believe adding these two things also gives you conformance to the equatable protocol, which allows you to check to see if things are equal to each other. But essentially, that is the reason why we did that, because we want to be able to do something like this. Is the new value that comes back as a result of this contact changing equal to the original contact or not? And that's the logic for how our contact did change property is computed. So now, guys, what I'm going to do to enable or disable my save button is go here and say .disabled, and I'm going to say contact did change. So I believe we have to negate that. And we're going to say .opacity, contact did change. Yes is 1.0. No is 0.5. So we're going to use a ternary to do that. And next up, let's go ahead and test this out to see if it works. So we're going to go into our contacts view, go to LeBron James. And guys, we notice that off the bat, that's disabled, right? And if I change this, it becomes enabled. And if I change it back to the original contact information, it becomes disabled again. So our logic is working there beautifully. So really quickly, let's just change this to like .net, save, boom. Now this is the original contact state. I could change it back to like .com, save, and everything is looking good there. So that is going to check the next item off our list. We are now enabling the save button only if changes have been made to a contact. And that's going to bleed directly into our next point. If changes have been made and the user tries to exit, show an alert confirmation. So let's go ahead and do that. And guys, I am going to talk about these three properties here and why we have left these up. I'm going to explain why implementing this contact as a state property was better than implementing all of these individual state properties. And it mainly has to do with checking to see if our contact has changed or not, right? Like imagine if, we can just go over it now. Imagine if I had to check each one of these individual properties had changed and reference them against like contact dot first name or contact dot last name. So I think what I would have to do that is do like on change of first name. Okay, is the first name equal to the contact dot first name? And then add another modifier for last name and another modifier for email. And that's obviously not scalable, right? Like what if this contact had like 15 different fields for email, work, phone, blah, blah, blah. That would quickly become out of hand, right? So encapsulating all of that into our contact object as a state property and then passing along the properties we need to as bindings to our text field through the object itself that is treated as a state property in this view is a much better approach because we can simply check with one modifier if the contact changed or not, right? So that's why I chose that approach. We don't need these properties anymore, so I'm going to delete those. And that's pretty important to understand. Took me a while to work through that in my head when I was building this. But this is looking really, really good, guys. And also keep a note of the time that we have. Like total coding time has probably only been about 35, 40 minutes. There's been a lot of time I've spent explaining things and stuff like I'm doing right now. And I believe we're just over an hour in this video. So once again, that gives you guys an idea of how much you can accomplish or should be able to accomplish in a given time frame with an app like this. And we're already in the bonus features section, right? So that means that like this is considered like, hey, you're probably doing really well in this if you had time to get to the bonus feature section. When I did this interview, I did make it to the bonus feature section. I don't think I completed all of them, but I got pretty close. And I ended up getting a job offer for over 200K from this job. So guys, let's go ahead and continue. We need to implement an alert, and it is going to be linked to our contact did change logic as well. So I'm going to say I want to create another state private var of show exit confirmation. And that's going to equal false. Before we implement our alert modifier, let's figure out how we want to handle the logic for toggling this property. So guys, when I cancel, I basically want to check to see if the contact has changed. If it has, then I want to present this alert, right? So for example, let me show you what it looks like. If I go here and change the contact and try to get out of it, it's going to say, hey, do you want to stay or discard your changes? So the logic for this should be pretty simple based on how we've structured our code. We just want to say, if contact did change, show exit confirmation equals true. Else, we'll dismiss. And guys, I'm going to extract this out to a function. So I'm going to go here and say func on cancel and paste that in there and go here and just say on cancel. So we can see how this really like just organizes our code really, really well. And, you know, we don't have to have a bunch of all of this like sort of logic or code inside of our button handlers, inside of our view body. It's a lot cleaner. Okay. So next up, we just have to get our alert modifier in here, and that should be pretty simple. Guys, in these interviews, if you don't have to remember how to do this stuff off the top of your head, like they allow you to use Google. So you could just say like, hey, how do I show an alert in SwiftUI? Because I honestly don't even remember that off the top of my head. There's so many different modifiers, but you should know that you have to create an alert modifier. And then if you need to look up how to do it, that's totally fine. Like interviewers shouldn't expect you to know all of this stuff off the top of your head. You should just know what you need to do and be able to say, hey, I know I need to show an alert. I know this is kind of how I do it. Can I look up like the actual syntax associated with it? And they'd be like, yeah, sure. And if they don't, you probably don't want to work there anyway. So guys, we're going to use title key is presented and actions here. So our title key is going to be unsaved changes. Let's get this alert back up and see what we want to do. Unsaved changes. You have unsaved changes. That's going to be part of our message. Let's see. Is presented is going to be show exit confirmation. Actions is going to be button, stay. And our role for that button is going to just be a cancellation. Dot cancel. And we don't need an action. Cancel will automatically dismiss the alert. And then button, discard changes. And the role for that is going to be dot destructive. And here we're going to say we want to dismiss. All right, so let's go ahead and test this out. That should be all we have to do. And go back to contacts view. And we'll go to LeBron James. We'll try to edit his information. We'll hit cancel and check that out. Guys, we don't need to implement the message or anything like that. This is totally fine. If we discard changes, it dismisses. And if we hit stay, it stays. So we're tested. We're good to go. That's another feature checked off the list. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, let's see. Enable. Okay, yeah, we're good. So we are complete with edit contact. Now, next up, guys, we need to do the same thing for deleting a contact, and we'll also implement swipe to delete. And then we will do a full breakdown of the code and hop into our follow-up questions as well. That's something that's pretty common. Like you might have like some sort of follow-up round that where like they'll ask you to sort of break down your code. That's especially common in take-home interviews. If this were a take-home interview, well, they'll be like, hey, we want to have a session to review everything you did, where they sort of grill you and ask you questions just to make sure that you actually know what you're doing and you didn't just copy and paste the code from ChatGPT or something. So we'll do that once we get these two features done. This should go pretty quickly as well. Back in our edit contact view, we are going to add another state property to show a delete confirmation. So we can just copy and paste that. We could just say show delete confirmation. And it's going to be very similar to our alert here. So we could just copy and paste that. And it's going to say delete contact with a question mark, I guess. Let's see what it looks like. Yeah, are you sure you want to blah, blah, blah. We don't need the message. We'll just have two actions for cancel and delete. So this will be cancel. This will be delete. And guys, we just need to change sort of how we handle the logic here. So, or what we call, right? So delete contact is what we're going to paste in when the user actually hits that delete button now. And when they hit the delete button, we are, instead of deleting the contact, we're going to just show the alert. So we're going to say show delete confirmation dot toggle. And let's see, we hit this, or let's go back to our contact view. And we'll go try to delete LeBron James. Oh, I think that is linked to, we need to go back to edit contact view and say show delete confirmation instead of show exit confirmation. And go back here. And test that out. Delete, sweet, delete, and it deletes him. We try to delete Kobe, we hit cancel, it doesn't. Okay, we're good to go there once again. And we can check that off our list. And we can see how quickly these are going, guys. These little bonus features, so that's good. And then let's see what we could do for swipe to delete. So because we are using a list, we are automatically going to get access to this feature with swiping. And it's actually really simple to implement, guys. We can just go into our contacts view, and on our contact row view, we could add some swipe actions. I could say .swipe actions content, and it's going to be a button, and we're going to say with animation view model .delete contacts, and we just pass that in there. And the label, is just going to be image system name trash, and I believe that's good. And once again, this is stuff that you could clearly look up. I've just done this so many times. I just kind of have this memorized, guys. And that's never a bad thing, right? Like if you have this stuff memorized, it just makes an interviewer go, wow, this guy is really, really fluent with SwiftUI development and overall iOS development. So it's a huge plus the quicker you can do these things. And then we're just going to give this a .tint of .red. And guys, if I go here, boom, that's showing up. Click it, we delete, boom. And that's it. So that completely wraps up our functionality for this feature. So let's just make sure we got everything checked off. We got our data. We got all these checked off. These. Yes, we are fully checked off, guys. So for the remainder of this video, we're going to be doing these follow-up questions first. And 2, we're just going to do a full overview of the project and explain why we did things the way we did them, just to make sure that we recap everything and we can articulate everything that we did and why. So let's get started with these follow-up questions, guys. So follow-up question number 1, how would we persist our data between app launches or app sessions? So right now we have local persistence, but if we were to modify this data and kill the app and relaunch it, it would just restart to this original list. So persisting them between app sessions, we have a couple different options. We could use, let me just paste the answer in here and we'll expand on it. So we could use Swift or core data. We could also potentially use the file storage with the file manager or SQLite. And all of these options are valid options. It would really just depend on the needs and or constraints of our project. So all of these things would give us persistence. Obviously, Swift data would probably be the most convenient option. It is the easiest, and we get a lot of built-in functionality with Swift data that allows us to easily manage like our persistence within a SwiftUI application. But obviously, that would depend on what version of iOS we support. If we were supporting versions of iOS that where Swift data had not yet been released, we could then opt into using core data. I'm personally not the biggest fan of core data. I think it's very overly complex. I think for something like this, we could probably just use file storage with the file manager and sort of write all of these contact informations like to a JSON file in the file storage of our application. We would then implement something like a cache where we would have the functionality to save and retrieve data from our file storage. And lastly, we could potentially use SQLite. Personally, I don't think that's necessary. We don't really need a relational database here. We don't really have a lot of querying capability, and SQLite requires a lot of boilerplate code and it's really complex. So I would most likely go with the file manager in that situation. Next up, guys, should we use a remote database for this application? I was actually asked this type of question in my interview with Meta, and my answer would be potentially yes. And it would be simply to serve as backup storage in case the user were to lose their device or something went wrong. But we don't need to pull information locally from our database because all of this is content that is generated by the user. There is no real interaction they need to have with other users on this application. So everything can be stored locally. And the only thing I would use a remote database for in this situation is to serve as backup storage. And we could make sure that we just periodically save the information once a day, once a week, something like that, and back it up to our remote database just so that the user doesn't lose their data in case of weird things happening, like losing their phone or getting it stolen or whatever. And Then guys, last but not least, how would we handle large list of contacts for performance? And this answer is more simple. I would pretty much just talk about pagination. We already are leveraging the use of a list in SwiftUI, which handles lazy loading for us. So we load items on an as needed basis, like as they appear or disappear from view on the screen. So we already get that sort of performance benefit by using the built-in performance optimizations in the SwiftUI list component. Another option would be to use something like a lazy VStack, but then we would lose the ability to have those built-in swipe actions. So I would definitely keep this as a list. But pagination is a big way to improve our performance and make sure that our scrolling is optimized. If we were to potentially have, like, let's say 10,000 contacts in our device, we wouldn't want to load all of that information at once. We could definitely paginate through to make sure that we load more data as the user scrolls to the bottom. So those are the follow-up questions, guys. And I think those are all pretty good answers there. And they communicate that you understand like what happens when you need to build apps that need to handle large data sets, and that you can understand the type of things you need to do to make an app scalable. And also things like business logic and requirements, right? With things like remote databases and also knowledge of more like in-depth data persistence and stuff like that. So I think those are 3 really good follow-up questions with 3 really good answers. So you guys should be prepared to answer follow-up questions about your code, whether that is for a live interview or a take-home interview when you do sort of a follow-up interview. And to conclude this video, guys, we're just going to go through and do sort of a wrap-up of everything we did. And I'm going to act as an interviewer asking sort of follow-up questions about your code. That is something that you will commonly see in take-home interviews and live interviews as like a post-game interview conference, so to speak, right? Like they're going to ask you what you did and why you did it. So let's go ahead and just start from the beginning with our contact model. So imagine an interviewer asks you like, hey, why did you make this identifiable and hashable? Like we only told you needed these properties. Why did you do this? So we sort of talked about this already. So I'll just do a quick recap. We know that to display items in a SwiftUI list, we need to conform to the identifiable protocol or have some unique identifier for each item. And this helps us accomplish that. And we know that to be able to navigate or create navigation links, our objects need to be hashable. So that's another reason we added that conformance. And then we also need to make sure that we can check to see if contacts are equal to each other or have equatability. And having these 2 protocol conformances gives us that ability to accomplish that. And that's why I added those protocol conformances and this ID property. Okay, next question. We see that you like added this initials property on the contact object. Why did you do that? Why didn't you place this on something like a view model or something like that? I would say, well, we absolutely could place this on a view model. I just think this property is more accessible if we place it on the model itself. That way, if we need to display this anywhere, we don't have to be coupled to implementing a view model there. Anywhere we display a contact, we could access the initials property through use of the contact object or by means of the contact object. So that's why I chose to put this here. So that's another follow-up question, guys. All right. So in our contacts view, let's just jump in and start breaking this down. I'd say, okay, so like, why did you choose to make a view model here? Like, why didn't you just put everything in the view? And a pretty simple answer to that question is like, well, I chose to go with the MVVM architecture here for this application. I personally think that is my preferred architecture when I build SwiftUI apps because of testability and a clear separation of concerns. All of our business logic goes in the view model, and that is responsible for providing our view with data and handling updates to our data source as well. Okay, great. So that's another awesome one right there. Next up, the rest of this view is pretty straightforward. I would maybe ask about the navigation destination stuff. I'd say, hey, like we noticed you use navigation stack and value-based navigation. Why did you choose to do that? And that's when I would start diving into like my knowledge of navigation stacks and the new navigation APIs with SwiftUI. I would talk about like how the navigation view API before was suboptimal. Basically, it coupled our navigation logic to the view, and this navigation stack and navigation destination modifier allows us to extract that functionality and give us value-based navigation that's a lot more data-driven and doesn't involve coupling our navigation logic to the view. And that comes back to why we set our contact up as hashable and set this up as a navigation link here and add our navigation destination modifier here. Sweet. So that handles our navigation. Next up, This view, let's talk about the searchable stuff. I would as an interviewer maybe ask like, hey, why did you implement the search results on the view model instead of doing it on the view? And once again, I would say because of that separation of concerns, we want to make sure that all of our logic associated with updating or filtering our data source is in one place. I believe that creates a better separation of concerns, and it also allows us to implement tests for that functionality in a much better way when all of that functionality exists on the view model. Great. So that pretty much wraps it up for the contacts view, guys. The rest of that is pretty straightforward. We just have a row view here with the swipe action. We have a sheet presentation for our contacts view and just a simple toolbar. So next up, let's go to our add contact view. I would say, hey, like I noticed you injected this as an environment or into the view environment. Why did you do that there? And I would simply say that, hey, well, adding a contact, we need to make sure that we add it to our source of truth or our data source. And that exists on the view model. So we need a reference to that view model inside of this view in order to accomplish that. And going down to our add contact function, another follow-up question I would ask was, how would you implement form validation here? And I would simply say, like, you would just want to make sure that all of these properties meet certain requirements. For example, you would want to make sure like a person's first name doesn't have letters or characters, like odd characters in it. Same with the last name. And then you would want to make sure their email is a valid email as well. And you could use string rejects to accomplish that. I like to set up extensions on strings that verify them, with certain rejects, like things for names, usernames, emails, something like that. So I would just add that form validation here and then potentially add some custom error handling as well to say like, hey, if they enter an invalid, field, show them some sort of error message when they try to hit done, or maybe implement some sort of UI component that shows an error message there if they enter invalid data. So yeah, that's I think a pretty good answer for how you would implement form validation there. And the rest of this is pretty straightforward. We call this add contact function to create a contact. Next up, guys, let's hop into our edit contact view. So here, there's definitely a couple interesting follow-up questions I would ask as an interviewer. We don't really need to talk about the view model because we kind of just did in the add contact view. Like this is just where our source of truth exists, and that's where we update information. The first thing I would ask about is like, hey, we noticed that you implement this like original contact and also have like a state property for this contact here. Like, can you talk us through the logic behind that and why you did that? And I'd say, yeah, sure. So basically, I'm using this original contact to serve as a reference to what the contact state was when I originally passed it in to this view. And then I have this state property for this contact here. And as users enter information into these fields, I am passing along the contact information as bindings to these text fields, all by way of this contact object. So if the user modifies that first name property, it will automatically change this object here. If the user modifies the last name property, it will also just modify this object here. So I am using this as a state property to like manage and track changes that happen on that object. And I'm using this as a reference to what the original state of the contact was. And this is something that will never change. And that feeds into this contact did change property and the logic behind how to calculate or compute whether or not a contact has changed. And that comes down to this on change modifier here. So basically, this is a modifier that allows me to fire off some sort of code when this particular object changes. So I know that every time the first name or last name or email is edited, this will fire off because the contact is changing. And I'll be able to get a look at the old value and the new value. And I can then reference the new value or the new state of the contact and check that against the original contact to ultimately determine if the contact changed or not. And then based on that, I have other logic inside of here that helped me implement the functionality to, check and see if I want to discard the changes or if I want to enable or disable that save button here, where we see the logic for that disabled in the button there. So yeah, that's asked and answered. The rest of this is pretty straightforward with our exit confirmation and show delete confirmation. It all sort of ties into that contact did change logic. And I think this is a really good setup for how to help us determine that. So next up, guys, we're just going to talk about the view model, and then we'll be done with our little mock interview here. So as an interviewer, I would first ask about this observable macro. I would say like, hey, why did you implement this? And what would the alternative be if the observable macro wasn't available? And I would then follow that up with an answer of saying, the observable macro just helps us remove a lot of boilerplate code. Previously, we had to conform to the observable object protocol and mark each one of these properties with published. And using the observable macro just helps us remove some of that boilerplate code. It is obviously only available in newer versions of iOS and SwiftUI. So, based on the needs of our project, if we needed to revert this back to using the previous setup, we absolutely could. And guys, that's just important to communicate to an interviewer that one, what that's replacing, and two, what the alternative would be if you didn't have that available to you. You can't always use the most up-to-date frameworks and iOS versions and SwiftUI versions and Swift versions in production apps. Like a lot of times apps support iOS versions that are 2 versions back from the most current one. So currently we're on iOS 18. Most places are probably only supporting iOS 16, and that's simply because a lot of people don't like updating their phones. So communicating that to an interview is very important. And I would say, okay, just sort of talk me through the structure of this view model. Like, why do you have this fetch contacts function here and all of these sort of CRUD operations? Why are they here and what are they doing? And I would say, yeah, I added this fetch contacts function because this sort of mimics what this would actually look like in a real life application where we might have to fetch contacts from some sort of remote or potentially local database. So this could potentially utilize something like async await if we needed to have like communication with some sort of remote API, or if we had some sort of computationally intensive task for fetching our contacts, if we potentially use the contacts API from the iOS system. So I think just wrapping that up in a function and firing that off is the sort of the cleanest way of getting our contact data. And this is obviously just a mock, but I think that's the best way of doing this. And then our CRUD operations, these are our simple like create, update, and delete guys. This simply adds a contact to the end of our list. Deleting a contact, we have to find the index of that contact to know which contact to remove. And this is our logic behind that. We can just check to see if the contact IDs are equal to one another. We could also say potentially 0 equals contact itself. And I believe that would work as well. But we could also just simply use that identifier because, each contact is guaranteed to have a unique ID and their IDs will never change. Same thing with updating a contact. We just have to find it in our data source and then, replace the object there. And then this function is our search results. So this is how we filter based on a query incoming from the user. We just make sure that the query isn't empty. And if it is, we just return whatever the contacts are. And then if it's not, we filter based on this logic here. If the first name contains the query or the last name contains the query or the email contains the query. And we use this localized case insensitive to make sure that our search parameters don't have to worry about case sensitivity. So for example, if a user accidentally has all caps on and they start typing out Michael Jordan, we want to ignore case sensitivity there to get the most accurate search results coming back. So that just about wraps it up, guys. You could then just, talk about maybe saying the view model is just responsible for supplying our view with data and updating the data source and stuff like that. But that pretty much wraps it up. And we got all of this done in an hour and a half. I believe that's about where we are in this video. And that was with me talking and explaining a lot of stuff, as I've mentioned before. So this is definitely something that you could be expected to accomplish within an hour to an hour and a half in a live interview. And, in a take-home interview setting, you would probably get about a day or two to get this done. But they would probably ask you to do more complex stuff. Like you might have to implement some caching and some like persistence between launches and stuff like that. Typically, live interviews are more simple because you're required to code live, and take-home interviews are a little bit more complex because you have more time and you can use resources like Google and ChatGPT. But that's going to wrap it up for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. In the next one, we are going to be building out a quiz app, and that's going to be a lot of fun. This is, once again, another interview that I actually received myself for a job that I believe was paying $175,000. And I actually got the job for it. doing this quiz interview problem. But I ended up taking the job at Meta instead. That's a fun story I'll tell you guys about in the next video. So get excited for that, guys. We'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Peace.